Hey everyone, I'm Chris Morrow, and we are here excited to talk to you about pushing the boundaries of voice RPGs, a game that we've been involved in from the beginning, Starfinder. Now, just to kick things off, what better way than to listen to a trailer?
It's dangerous to get lost down here. You're about to find out how dangerous.
Starfinder. Starfinder is a science fantasy role-playing game that puts you in the role of a bold outer space adventurer.
Looks like these wires lead to an explosive of some kind.
Exploring the mysteries of a weird and magical universe.
You're here to steal our score! We gotta get out of here!
Was I supposed to stop that goblin, or...?
Through the decisions you make, your character will grow in wealth and skill.
Good work. I can tell you've got what it takes to work with the Starfinders.
Or meet a grisly end.
Cut the yellow wire.
Look out!
Yeah, I get pretty jazzed about that. I've listened to it probably, I don't know how many times. Get pretty excited about it. As I mentioned, my name's Chris Morrow. I'm a senior producer. I'm joined today by Ezra Kim and Jared Bartlett. Their parts will be coming up in just a few minutes. But today I wanted to take you through some of the things that we have learned working in voice gaming, so building games with the to be played through Alexa. And we get really excited about this space because it's early stage gaming. So you don't need much more than an idea, an interesting mechanic, a fun use case, and you can prototype something and get it in front of customers really quickly. And then there's this really fun ability to bring gaming into places where maybe it wasn't previously accessible. So for example, we see a lot of Starfinder players really interested in playing in the car during the commute. And of course, now with fewer people commuting at the moment, we see them playing at home and in the living room. We're really excited about voice as a new gaming paradigm, and it's pretty awesome because it's early stage. So really, all you need is a good idea, an interesting mechanic, a great story, and you can get something in front of customers really quickly, which is sort of what we were able to do here with Starfinder. We also are really excited about this idea of delightfully extending gaming into hands-free use cases. So think places like the car, or when you're preparing food in the kitchen, places where you have this idea of sort of ambient gaming, or maybe before you were listening to music and now you'd like to play an RPG. And then this, I touched on it a little bit, but this opportunity to think critically and really engage with exciting gaming mechanics. And I'll talk about those a little further into the presentation. But for me, it's really exciting to approach a blue ocean opportunity and really go out to the players and play test and figure out what works and what doesn't. And then for us, this project was a natural 20, which if you've played tabletop role-playing games or you've watched Critical Role, this is probably familiar to you, but natural 20, you roll a 20-sided die when you're playing a tabletop role-playing game like Starfinder, for example. And if you are trying to overcome an obstacle, a 20 on the dice means you automatically succeed. And while we certainly didn't automatically succeed with this project, it fit the interests of the team very well. We are tabletop gamers ourselves, and we found it very engaging to think about what is an authentic experience when you're talking about a completely different use case. A tabletop RPG, the setting is, or has been, people, 4 to 5 players around a table, a completely analog experience. And how would we create an experience, a game experience that felt authentic, but to be experienced in a single player way and through audio, as opposed to some of the tabletop RPG adaptations through video games. And then finally, just the excitement of doing something new. It was really enjoyable to combine these three. Let's talk a little bit about Starfinder, the brand. So Paizo Inc. is a tabletop RPG publishing company. They're in Redmond, Washington. They own both the Pathfinder and Starfinder RPGs, and they create physical books, digital products, and then they sell them, and then they license that IP for digital adaptation. And in playing Starfinder, a picture says 1,000 words. So you can see here, part of the team, we were doing field research, all very professional, and really diving into what is the experience. And this is the traditional Starfinder experience, where you have multiple people around a table, accessories, books, and it's this collaborative storytelling experience. And starting to touch on that authenticity piece, what we looked at using was the Starfinder Incident at Absalom Station. It's this Dead Sun's adventure path. Adventure paths for Paizo are small 30 to 40 page booklets. They're like ready-made adventures, and they sell these bi-monthly. This is the most popular for the brand, and so we felt that this was a great place to start with an adaptation to be both familiar to players, but also a different take on it. And then finally, they had just released the Starfinder Beginner's Box, which was a streamlined rule set designed to take players who had never experienced it before into 4th level characters. So, up to a year's worth of play, depending on frequency. And using that rule set as to power the in-game rules, one, it simplified our implementation, but two, it provided a familiar framework to experienced players. The goals for Starfinder was to expand the Starfinder audience to single players. And this sort of ties in with the third point in terms of bring the RPG experience to players without access. Historically, you need players. You need people who are willing to commit 3 to 4 hours at some frequency to play, and people who are willing to purchase the materials to run the game. So Paizo has been interested in expanding the audience to single players in a way that's enjoyable. And then for us, we were very curious to target high autonomy players through this voice medium, because voice typically, what we have seen is that short form experiences are delightful, like trivia or quiz games. And so we were interested to see, could we create something delightful that does have a high volume of content. And so as we thought and reflected, and we created some prototypes, and we got them in front of players, and we got feedback from various groups, what we arrived at is the essential experience. And this is 4 pillars that guided us as we've thought about the design of the game and the way that the player interacts with the game. And so the first pillar is this immersion. You feel like you're there through high quality sound design. And what we found is that when going from a short form game to a long form game, the quality of the sound design became really critical. And then the next piece in sustaining that duration of play was connection. Players had to become emotionally invested in their characters, and we found that the best way to do this was through professional voice actors. We found that the synthetic voices are great for AI or dynamic content, but if we want to build an emotional connection between characters in the game, it had to be real human voices. And then agency. We talked about targeting high autonomy players. It was important that players are able to drive and develop their own characters through meaningful decisions. And then finally, simplicity. And I'll talk about this in a few slides, but your experience is frustration-free through playtesting and design iterations. And that's how we arrived at this, the type of control scheme that lends itself to both volition, autonomy, but also is not too complex to manage. So the experience itself, Scoundrels in the Spike, which is what the audio trailer that you heard to kick us off. So it has many of the familiar mechanics of an RPG. There's classes, you have persistent character, there's stats, there's skills, inventory, turn-based combat, rule sets that are familiar. The narrative is driven by interactions with NPCs. It's 8 to 10 hours of total gameplay. Scoundrels in the Spike we released in December. It's a 30-minute free-to-play experience. And then we model episodic television or episodic content where we are releasing 6 premium episodes that will come out this summer and this fall. So starting to think about diving into the game itself, now that we understand sort of the framework of what we're talking about, I want to do a quick overview of the Alexa service because I recognize that is a little different from a PC game or a console game. So I'm going to talk about the Alexa terminology, and then I'm going to talk about the control scheme, specifically as it relates to our design, the design of the narrative and the design of the way that the player interacts with the game, and some of the trade-offs that we had to make. What you see on the far left is the player. Now, the player is going to speak into the microphone. They want to do something. That's called an utterance, what the player actually says. Now, that utterance is transformed by the Alexa service into a string value called an intent. And so that intent, we go from utterance on the far left side to intent, moving to the cloud, which is from the Alexa service into the cloud, and that's where our game logic and game content resides. And what we receive is a string value called an intent, and then we serve, based on the player's state and the intent, we serve content back to the player that matches what we think the next player's state is and the desired player's action. And then we're able to serve that back through the Amazon Alexa service back to the device, and that's the interaction cycle. Now, let's just go ahead and let's listen to a little example. So this first audio clip just sets the scene.
You move cautiously down the corridor. Out of the corner of your eye, you notice that one of the large floor panels up ahead isn't quite right. Looking closer, you realize that it's actually been pried up, and some wires are poking out. RAIA approaches cautiously to get a closer look.
Huh. Looks like these wires lead to an explosive of some kind hidden below the panel. Someone really doesn't want unexpected visitors.
The large floor panel spans the width of the corridor.
So as you can see here, what we've done is we have served a problem to the player, and then we're going to give them a choice. You can either attempt to leap over the bomb, or you can attempt to try to disarm it. And then, so we serve that prompt to the player. They choose between those options, and then we receive that intent, either disarm the bomb or jump over it, and then we serve them the next player state. So let's listen to what happens if we choose to jump over it.
You take a few steps back and then run forward, launching yourself into the air. Mid-air, time slows, and it occurs to you that you started your leap far too early.
Well, that didn't go well. But this just serves as sort of this example of one, the interaction pattern between our game and the player, and then also serves as a little bit of an exposition and a lead-in to the control scheme. What we want the player to say is either jump over or disarm the bomb. What is actually true is that they could say anything. And it is also true that in beta testing, what we've found is that players churn at a rate up to 15% higher when Alexa doesn't handle their input. And what we also know is that our ability to handle that input gracefully is entirely manual. So what you see on the right-hand side is the syntax that we write the code in. It's called a ABC file. What you see on the right-hand side is an example of all of the different utterances, all of the variations that we would have to handle in a specific scene just for the player to achieve a simple branch. Go to the Goblin room, go to the Skittermander room. And that was a very manual process that is difficult to scale and difficult to QA. It's difficult to validate that through QA testing. So on the one hand, we have this higher churn if players' input is unhandled. And on the other hand, we have a manual effort that's very difficult to replicate as we continue game production. What we were trying to do was similar to the problem that was solved or tackled by text-based adventure games in the early to mid 1980s. Because when they were designing games, generally speaking, it was a new type of entertainment, a player that was new to PC gaming, generally speaking, and a new type of control scheme. So, typing in an answer to a prompt. And so we started to look at how did Infocom train players back in the day. We actually got in touch with Brian Moriarty, and what he told us, and you have the quote here, but what he told us is that they were very deliberate in the way that they designed the player interaction with the parser, and the goal was to minimize frustration and improve the illusion of agency, which is exactly what we were trying to do. So what you see here is illustrating some of the similarities, where on the left-hand side you have the opening scene of Wishbringer, where first there's a location that's illustrated, the hilltop, and then there's a description of the hilltop, and then there's some indication of what the player could do next. The benefit that Wishbringer has, and other text-based adventure games have, is the player's ability to scroll up, to read all of the text again. Whereas with audio, the player has to process it in real time and then make a decision. And so while Wishbringer has an open-ended prompt, okay, what do you want to do now? We offer two choices. Do you want to investigate the diagnostics room or continue down the passage towards the clanking? And this is based off of all of our playtest iterations, where we found that an open-ended prompt like Wishbringer works if you have additional context and the player can scroll up and has additional information visually. But in a situation where the player has to remember the setting, the problem they're trying to solve, and then the choices to solve it, what we found is that two choices feels right. It's not overwhelming to players. So given that, even with an explicit illustration like, do you choose the diagnostics room? Do you choose to continue investigating? Players still will provide unanticipated input. So one of the challenges that we had to solve was choosing a character is challenging. A character creation session, when you get started with a tabletop role-playing game, can take hours. We needed to get players choosing a character in minutes. What we implemented was a very basic personality quiz. 3 questions, and based on player answer to those 3 questions, we would select a character on their behalf. We tried to make these very explicit, we play tested them, and this is still what we got.
Imagine the type of spacefaring adventurer you'd like to play while answering the following questions. At your core, are you a leader, loner, or fiercely loyal friend?
I mean, those seem like fairly straightforward options. What we continually received once we had shipped the game was all of the above, which we had never seen in any of our beta tests, any of our play tests. We just didn't anticipate that as an input. And so players were churning because this wasn't being handled. So there's a couple of different ways that we can handle this. So we've experimented with pretending that we handle it. So when the player says all of the above, We acknowledge that they say that, and we say, great, we've chosen a character for you. The other thing that we can do, and this was something that we also saw in text-based adventure games, is we give the prompt, are you a leader, loner, or fiercely loyal friend? We receive an input back that we didn't expect, and so we reprompt the player. We say, you can choose from one of these options. Are you a leader, loner, or fiercely loyal friend? And what we found is that this is also a key component of training the player on the control scheme, where we want to balance both. We found this was the best way to balance handling a nearly infinite number of possible inputs, balancing that against training the player on the control scheme so they can achieve what they actually want to do. Which takes us a little bit into this. This takes us into a clash between agency, volition, and inputs, because we stated at the outset one of the goals was to target high autonomy players, and we know that with volition, we need to present choices to players that they want to choose, but we're at most giving players between 2 and 3 choices at any one time. How do those things sort of meld together? And how do we sort of balance agency versus production effort? And helpfully, Ezra Kim is going to talk about just that right now.
All right, thank you, Chris. So my name is Ezra Kim. I'm a software developer with Amazon, focused on Alexa Games and also skill experiences. I have developed many tools for building skills on Alexa and also building games for Alexa as well. And today I will be talking about, as Chris mentioned, some of the game design aspects of Starfinder. So before we move on, I want to just kind of clarify and just go over quickly about some of the things that we already know about voice games. And that is, the user experience is king. What that means is that no matter what the software behind the product is, the key information is, and key part of the experience is the design, the narrative design, sound design, voice design, even the game design, the how it plays. Because if those things don't align, no matter how elegant or fancy the software and algorithm behind the tech is, it will not be really received, because at the end of the day, players really do not see that as well. So what does it mean for us developers working in these space? And I'm just here to say that, it is our job to make sure our software framework and the tools enable designers to kind of go through their iteration process and design and testing and experimental phases. Even if you, as a developer, is a designer yourself, you want to have that separation so that you can design without having to always worry about the limitation of the software or a limitation of the tool you're using. So you want to enable that as much as possible. Okay, so Starfinder. This is a solo adventure adaptation on Alexa for tabletop RPG, which is really great. I love tabletop RPG myself. And so coming into this space, you can think of all the excitement and all the kind of future tech you were imagining as you were playing back in the day, coming together to say, okay, this is the time. This is the time that we're going to do all these things. So that's what we did. We just kind of gathered around and ideate on what is the possibility of Starfinder on Alexa. And that is some of the key characteristics of the tabletop RPG. The free form, answers and narration, right? The game masters will say, hey, here's a scene, here are the characters. You are in front of a tavern with all these people around. What do you do? And based on your character, you can decide what to do, what choices to make, who to talk to, and then you roll the dice to determine how well that did. So obviously, it's impossible. Well, maybe it is possible in the future somewhere, but for now, it is very difficult to think about ways to implement. How do we do that and mimic that? So some of the ideas were open prompts like text adventures, where we say, what do you do? And we handle most of the cases that we can anticipate given a setting. Maybe that is too difficult, then we could even think about using player verbs. So for example, walk, talk to, or interact with, drink, and stuff like that, and having to teach people, the players, of those verbs, and eventually getting their vocabulary more and more so that they can have more intense and complex interactions. Another thing is having to make sure that the combat experience and these theater mind concept to kind of translate to this space. So we had a lot of ideas on that. And also making sure to have a lot of conditional narratives to handle all these different choices and branches so that players feel that they are making choices that are unique to them. They're having an experience that are unique to them. And making sure to have tools. As a developer, it was very important and exciting to think about all the tools and configurations and setups to enable that so that those things can be done rapidly. So, sky's the limit, right? Well, it turns out sky is not the limit. There is actually a very realistic limitations on what you can do when you actually get down to the table or the drawing board, starting to design what are the technical possibilities and whatnot. So let's see some of the limitations that we faced as we were playing through the beta testers and the feedbacks we were getting. Okay, so it turns out the open prompt, Chris has mentioned a little bit about this earlier. I'm going to go a little deeper on what we did in order to change that decision. But is that the open prompt of what do you do is overwhelming. The common phrase that we use in game space is that is the term analysis paralysis, right? When there's so many choices to make, players are frozen with some sort of fear, I guess, or indetermination. Like they cannot make any decisions effectively. And especially with the Alexa as a platform, it is a problem because of the security reasons. The Alexa platform doesn't allow you to open the mic and listen to players for a long time. So we can't wait for their indecision. Actually, we need to make sure that the experience is immediately understandable and immediately answerable. So that was some of the limitations we faced. Also, another thing is the confused player. So we had a lot of narration, this beautiful description of the situation and characters and all that things. But problem is that it serves as a red herring where players are confused on what to focus on. So that was another thing that we faced. Another thing is that no matter how well you describe the situation and no matter how well you play out the audio so that it's engaging, there are moments when people cannot focus 100% of the time. And there is a problem with information overload. You can be teaching people these verbs. However, unlike having a display on the screen, not being able to see these options constantly and remind yourselves, even the teaching and the vocabulary learning becomes difficult. It's hard to retain the information in your head as a player, even for the hardcore player, and then also the casual players, obviously. So what do we have to do? We have to make the great sacrifice. I'm calling it great sacrifice because for the developers and the creators, this is a point where it causes the most heartache. There's this amazing ideas that you feel like there's a potential here. You can do something more. Maybe if you research a little more, maybe if you explore different things, different ways to implement this, maybe there's a possibility to kind of retain this feature. But you know, with the timeline coming up and the desire to achieve certain goal and feature set, there comes a time where you have to cut the features, and it's actually better to simplify by cutting the feature, as we will see here today. So some of the things that are listed here on the slide is, you know, we cut expositions, cut open prompts, cut story branches, and complex interactive systems, and I'll go deeper into each one of them. Okay, so here's an example of a complex interaction. We have a companion called RAIA in the game where the player is supposed to kind of go through the game with this character, kind of to get this feeling of playing in a party where you're not playing by yourself, but you're playing with someone else, and that person can help you or, you know, have a kind of like banter back and forth and stuff like that, which has been very positive experience. However, initially, in the name of autonomy and in the name of giving freedom of choices, we had an experiment where we allowed the players to choose to go with RAIA, like go on an adventure with a companion or not go with a companion. And it was a problem because as soon as we added this in the beginning of the adventure, it just made the combination of the possible combinations of all the narrations double, even triple and quadruple. It was a combinatorial explosion of content. So for every scene now we had to worry about, was RAIA there or is RAIA not there? And this is really really difficult to scale with the kind of amount of team that you could potentially have in the beginning of the project. So with much heartache, we had to cut that experience and make it so that RAIA comes along by default. Actually, this was very beneficial because, in fact, the experience of the game, turns out, it was most enjoyable with the companion. So by getting rid of that bad choice, quote unquote bad choice, we're actually guaranteeing the players to have a good experience most of the time instead of them choosing to have a bad experience. And this kind of goes into the user experience tuning and stuff like that. Sometimes, the choices are, you don't always have to give choices to everything. The choices can be limited to good experience and good experience. It shouldn't be a good experience and you're going to play the rest of the game really terribly and boring. That's not really a choice. That's actually kind of trapping the players and you don't want to do that. So that's something that we learned that was pretty interesting. So that's one thing that we did. In addition to that, we also cut a lot of the branches. So that was one of the branches that we cut, right? In the beginning, the choice to go with RAIA or not. There were also a lot of decision points in the interaction where you could do this or that, and then it branches completely where the ending changes a lot. And there could be potentially, thousands of endings if you think about all the potential branches that could result in something. What had to be done was to cut the branches and make sure it has this bottleneck features of making some important choices, having the flavors and interesting decisions, and then the arc of the story, the overall flow of the narrative comes back to a bottleneck and branches and bottleneck. So each experience for making the choices feel unique in a sense that there is a payoff in a branching way. It pays off, but in terms of enjoyable and convincing narratives, you are coming back to this point of the center where it makes sense, that we can guarantee to make sense in every point. And actually, this is not something that we invented, because once we did this and we kind of looked around other text adventures or existing interactive fictions, or even just RPG games or other games in general, we noticed that there are this thing called the diamond structure of the narrative, branching, and then also there's also something called branching storylets gated with gameplay levels, and that's all the same thing. And so yeah, and it was kind of reassuring to see that there were other people and other developers and designers coming to a same conclusion to achieve this goal, and it's actually very effective. So that's something had to be done for Starfinder. All right, and then we also need to cut exposition. So difference between exposition and narrative branch is that exposition talks about the description of the world, right? It talks about how the tavern looks, if there's a tavern, or the space station looks like. And it talks about what the person looks like and what they're doing and all those things. In tabletop RPG case, it's pretty good because you see the person that's talking, the game master, and you kind of interact and have a little fun with it. But with this limited resources of, hey, there's this branching that is limited, it kind of throws people into a red herring space where people start to pay attention to the wrong thing. It's like, oh, that red hair, does that matter? And should I retain it? And in the space of limited, memory space of the player playing the game, you want to make sure that you kind of clarify and make sure that there is a clear distinction to this is an exposition and this is a choice. So we had to do that by kind of reducing the exposition to a very important set of descriptions only. And in addition to that, Jared will talk about this later on the sound design. Sound design became very, very crucial. That's because what we can say in a single sentence or multiple sentences to describe a scene can be achieved by a background environmental sound, or even just one sound effect of the static buzzing while the narration is going is sufficient to say there is a electrical wiring that's running amok right? So that was a great way for us to reduce the number of minutes that our players are exposed to listening to only. However, that didn't sacrifice the amount of understanding that the players could have. They could immediately grok what that scene was. It was actually easier to imagine for players during the beta test with the sound effects and less words, which is great. That's exactly what we wanted. All right, so now we're going to talk about the choices. Another thing that we had to do was getting rid of that open prompt and getting rid of the verbs. So then we come to the decision of what kind of choices should we make available for the players to choose from. And we arrived at 3 major distinctive choice varieties. And we call this a choice cocktail because at the end, when you mix these together in a right way, it makes this delicious cocktail of choices. So the first one that I want to point out is the strategic choices. These are the basically medium term, an episode term choices, where you make a choice to branch the story so that the narrative flows into a kind of interesting way so that you get that payoff. And that is a midterm because you get that payoff around the mid-length of the story where episode ends, not the entire season. And then there is a tactical decision of combat, right, where you make a decision and then there's a payoff immediately. So for example, somebody's shooting at me and I say, take cover, and cover gives me increased defense. That's an immediate payoff. And that is easy to see, and it's strategic and tactical, and I'm making a decision right now. It feels almost reactive currently, even though, the interaction of Alexa says something, player responds, feels kind of transactional. It could give that feeling of reactionary choice compared to everything else. And then there is an emotive decision. Emotive decision is something that is character building. So in tabletop RPG, it's important sometimes for people to interact with their own character and build their own character in a way that they envision their character to be. The personality of the character and the kind of emotion that you want to develop, relationship that you want to develop with the other characters within this world. So decisions like, how do you react to this person being angry, or are you angry or are you excited about this thing? That kind of reveals the characteristic of the player and the character that the player is trying to play. And that is effective in kind of making this relationship, but also having this potential long-term payoff. The player feels invested in the character that they're playing just outside of the narrative. Rather than it being a third-party perspective looking into somebody else's story, you jump into this kind of more immersive feeling of, I am this character, I am building this character for myself, I feel more personal connections. And of course, it's really important for all these choices, for long-term, short-term, and mid-term, to have a payoff, to feel that, okay, the decisions that I made either a long time ago or just now or a few turns away has a payoff, and it paid off in a way that I feel satisfied. And it doesn't have to be good in terms of satisfied. It just needs to be satisfying in the sense that that decision did something. And so we mixed these things and made the great choice cocktail. We call it great because at the end of the day, we didn't know at the time, but at the end of the day, when the players came back with the reviews and the way that players reacted, it really showed that these things were effective in kind of translating the feeling of tabletop RPG without completely porting the experience. So just kind of getting the essence of the tabletop RPG. Okay, so having said all this, there's a new hope for the sky, right? We said, sky's the limit. Oh, sky's not the limit, but maybe there is a chance to get to the sky somehow. Setting the goal high. So this leads into the whole idea of, okay, so we found something that works for the time being. And there is a potential for building on top of this. So we see that reducing narratives, reducing expositions, reducing choices are all cutting, and simplifying to make sure that the core experience is great experience. However, we can now think about, now that we know a base set that works, we can think about what can we build on it? What can we change? What can we experiment on top of this working formula to add these original hope for the blue sky ideas to kind of achieve those things without having to worry about all the challenges that was faced in the initial stage of development. And that is up to you guys, the developers and the designers out there who's kind of interested in the space, to just kind of take this and build on top of that. And I'm excited to see what comes out of it. But yeah, so is this true? Did it actually work? As core players, like the players that are familiar with the brand Starfinder, so there are hardcore players who read all about their blogs, all about their narratives, the new content they always purchase and stuff like that, actually loved it, and they understood the limitations, why that was there, and what the purpose of the game was. And also casual players were having a great time, which was unusual for tabletop RPG in general, because tabletop RPG was kind of known to be a little bit unapproachable for casual players because of all the prep work that is set and the kind of difficulty and to the unfamiliarity of the genre. So yeah, and I can show you the reviews here. Yeah, you can read through it. Just to say briefly, they loved it. 5 stars. You can go to the page right now in Amazon, search for Alexa Starfinder, the skill, and you can see all the great reviews. People are loving it. A lot of people are talking about playing it in the car, in the kitchen, or even in between their play session, which indicates that there are core players who are enjoying this experience. So yeah, this gives us great hope, and I'm excited to see where this takes next. Okay. So, to talk about the sound design that I mentioned earlier, we have Jared. Yeah, Jared?
All right, thank you, Ezra. Yeah, so I'm Jared Bartlett. I'm a sound designer at Clean Cuts Interactive, a game audio company. And our team handled all the sound design and audio for this project. This was a super fun project for us. When we first heard about it, we were really pumped because, for one, it's this really cool Starfinder universe that just we were given the opportunity to really bring an audio identity to. And two, as sound designers, we love getting the opportunity to work without any visuals, so it's sort of like, hey, this is an audio-only game. The possibilities are really endless, and that's just a fun place to be as a sound designer. So, that being said, it certainly brings some challenges not having any visuals. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the iterations and challenges we went through. I will say we really worked to immerse ourselves in the brand. Normally we're working with visuals, but since that wasn't, we didn't have access to that, because it's an audio-only experience. We went as far, we're setting our studios up with all the books and, really trying to just hone in on what this world should sound like, because that's a big job for us. So, in general, just sort of like most games, I'm going to just talk about sort of the buckets of sounds that we sort of had to deal with for Starfinder. A lot of design principles that would go for any game are really gonna hold true in an audio only game. Just there are some things where audio obviously becomes more important. That's the only way the player's interacting. So the main buckets were the sound effects assets themselves. So these would have been standalone assets that you're going to hear multiple times over and over, called by code. So, weapons, UI, handful of background loops that we'll talk about later. And then we had a really, obviously, as you can kind of imagine from hearing about the design up to this point, a large amount of linear scenes that were mixed with narration, dialogue, sound effects, some music, not tons. And those linear scenes were really what kind of built up the storyline. Obviously, these are all the scripted events and all the different paths, and all those had to sort of be built out and designed. We'll talk a little bit about the UI design. UI design is always really challenging, and with no visual support, its purpose is actually really crucial. These UI assets are going to define a lot of the feel of the game, and they're really going to go a long ways towards telling the player what's happening. So making sound design that really clearly communicates the intent of the sound is crucial. So, you know, we kind of quickly realized that we had to really sort of internally, and we would do this, you know, okay, what does this sound have to do? We would sort of dialogue a lot about this. So we'd have to, you know, question, okay, what is this sound really trying to tell the player? Is the player in danger? Are they successful in combat? Or, you know, a big one, are they being prompted to speak? We really wanted every sound to have clear signaling, and we just found that we had to really even question that within our own brains before we would kind of tackle a sound. The other issue with all the sounds in the game, but that was really especially relevant to the UI sounds, was creating sounds that would translate on different hardware devices. So all the different, you know, Alexa devices that this could potentially play on, whether it's on your phone, in your car, in your living room, so on. So, and handling some data compression that's going to go along with those as well. So from a frequency range perspective, we sort of found that we really couldn't rely on anything over 10K. That was probably just not going to be, any information in the sounds or at that point was not going to make it. And we really kind of wanted that sweet spot to sort of make sure the meat of what we're trying to get across is heard on all these different devices. We really wanted that to sort of be in the 3 to 8K range. So with these challenges in mind and our goals to really communicate to the player, what we came to was that simplicity was really going to work in our favor. So as opposed to designing sounds that were a lot of layers, you know, a synth here and a whoosh and a bang boom, whatever, we found that limiting the number of layers in sounds really made it easier for the player, for the user, to have a clear sense of what that sound's intent was and what it's trying to, how it's trying to progress the story along. You know, we experimented a lot with different palettes of sounds, and we were sort of able to kind of come up with a batch of some synth sounds that we could use to create pretty much all the UI, that we could sort of use that to kind of express different ways that we needed to lead the player or communicate with the player. We were sort of fortunate where we, you know, this sci-fi world, we were able to kind of find a palette of sounds that we could do that with and would also still fit into the Starfinder universe. So I'm going to just play you one sound just to kind of get a sense of this. So, you know, obviously this is a tabletop sound, so the sound of the dice rolling is a really common sound. You're going to hear this a lot over the course of a game. So it's very short, not a lot of tail, and you'll kind of hear how it's just the simplicity of it. But we think it ended up working really well at the end of the day. So here's that. So there's like a rolling aspect to it. It's very simple, no tail. It's cut really short. Kind of an arpeggiator feel to help sort of symbolize the dice rolling, the dice sort of moving out. So the other issue with all of our assets in general, like sort of saying, like keeping things short, is, you know, so with our initial discussions with the developers and designers, we knew we were going to be up against some polyphony restraints. So we weren't going to just be able to have, you know, dozens of sounds playing at the same time. So in order to not have the pace of the game get stuck at any point, we knew we were going to need to keep things really short. One instance where this was particularly an issue was in the combat sequences. So the idea of the combat sequences from a design perspective was there would be a weapon fire, a anticipation, or we ended up sort of treating that as like a projectile fly, and then the projectile impact or missing, and then a UI if you missed. So if we ended up treating those as single assets, boom, 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 you know, each one of those, we found we were going to get really limited with the amount of detail and nuance we could put into some of the sounds, because we wouldn't have the opportunity to allow any carryover from you know, the sound of the whatever weapon firing into the projectile flying. We wanted to really enhance that stuff and have that be have a lot of character, because that's where some of that sci-fi coolness is going to come in. So what we ended up doing was just sort of combining all of those sounds into unique assets. So it ended up meaning that it increased our file count by a significant amount in terms of the amount of sounds we needed to make, because we needed to sort of solve for every weapon type and hit or miss, and even different, as the player progresses, different iterations and add-ons to that stuff. So, but at the end of the day, it allowed us to just make them a lot cooler and a little more fun to listen to, and that you know, I think we all think that went a long ways towards making the combat experience really engaging and fun. So I'm going to go ahead and just play a couple sounds here. This will just be a sequence. Excuse me. This will just be a sequence of sounds where you'll sort of hear that change. So you'll hear the fire, the fly, the hit, and the UI, and you'll hear like a hit and a miss for a handful of different weapon types. So let's go ahead and take a listen to that. Cool. So it's like a kinetic fire, a grenade, and a magic fire, and yeah, making the decision to combine those, we think paid off. So let's go ahead and start talking about some of the linear assets, some of the story assets that we had to do. You know, I think the biggest thing that we found when we were putting these together was, and to sort of harken back to what Chris was saying, like, this is where the immersion is really going to happen, right? This is where we really need to make all this awesome tech and all this great design and all this great voice acting and all this needs to come to life. Really, like the timing of how all these assets hand off to each other is just what's super critical. You know, we often kind of would think about it like a radio play. Like if you're this is sort of driving down and like I need to be like really immersed in this. And so we put a lot of care into, you know, okay, I'm on dialogue now, this is where I'm focusing, but I'm kind of leading to this, and I want the player to sort of know this is coming and describe something that might be happening underneath narration, and to just sort of, and actually sometimes utilizing like natural breaks in the narration to allow sounds to pop through. So I'm going to go ahead and play just one scene that we think highlighted this really well here.
With a warning klaxon, the bay doors open. The sudden rush of escaping atmosphere tugs on you, but the harness holds you safely in place. The goblin isn't so lucky. With a wail that quickly turns to silence as the bay's air escapes, the goblin and her crates are ejected out into space. If she's lucky, her suit will keep her alive until authorities can pick her up.
We definitely had fun sending the goblin out in space. That was entertaining for everybody. So, you know, another thing, and actually this is kind of pulling back to what Ezra was saying, where, you know, having to sort of cut certain, you know, exposition to keep the user engaged, that kind of came back to us as the sound designers to really make sure these ambiences were lifelike and engaging, and were telling the Starfinder story. So, and actually the ambient sound design was the first thing that we did. So we were working with the Paizo people and all the sort of the relevant parties to make sure that our initial world of ambient sound was on track. So I think that, you know, the biggest thing that we found with, I mean, this is true in a lot of sound design, but like, again, not having the visuals to tell more of the story, we found that we wanted all the ambiences to rely more on one-shots and sort of ear candy, in a way that we might call it, to have little things that are going to constantly grab the ear and really fill out what this world sounds like. So, as opposed to relying on static sounds. So with that in mind, I'm just going to play you another scene where this is sort of on a mag train going down. I think this is just, you'll sort of hear a lot of hustle and bustle, and some things that we think highlighted this approach really well.
You catch a ride on a maglev train leading down deeper into the spike. As you ride along in the cramped carriage, squashed between a bug-faced Sheeran and a four-armed Kasaltha, you look out the window at neighborhoods even shabbier than your own. You may be local, but you still know better than to go all the way down to the ghost levels. Fortunately, this job will only take you to the edge of Pipetown. You get off at your stop, and the crowd quickly thins. By the time you reach the access corridor, the coordinates specified, you're alone. Or almost alone. As you approach the hallway entrance, a human worker in coveralls stumbles out, holding a bloody gash on his head. He limps towards you.
Awesome. Yeah, those were some of the things we went through with this project. It was a really, really fun and exciting project, and we're all at Clean Cuts really proud of it. It's a neat thing to have been a part of, and with that, I will hand this back to Chris.
Thanks, Jared. So just wrapping everything up, what we really like about this space is extending these use cases into gaming where maybe it wasn't possible before. We also really love, as you know, you've heard from Ezra and you've heard from Jared, this was a big portion of the team. And so we were able to take Starfinder from this, you know, idea of, man, what would it be like to play an RPG using your voice and turn it into this really delightful audio experience in about 8 months. And the team was not that big. We also are really excited about this idea of a transmedia experience. And so there's this, you could think of in content production, you end up with storylines that don't make the, you know, they don't make the game, or they don't make the episode, they don't make the overall season. And because it's using the same assets, it's using writers, it's using voice actors, it's being put together, edited together with in sound post-production, we think this will be a really interesting space to give players an opportunity to explore storylines more deeply than they might be able to within the setting of a video game or perhaps a season of television. So we get pretty jazzed about that. Then finally, you can explore all of the other sessions that are being offered this week. And then if you have any kind of additional questions, feel free to stop by the Ask the Experts session. We have all experts on every technology that's being discussed this week. Will be at, those experts will be at the Ask the Experts session. And then for more details on the Starfinder retrospective, feel free to check out the Resource Center. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. We really appreciate being able to share what we've learned, creating the Starfinder interactive audio adventure.